Hi, I'm Donna and welcome to part 4 of my series on how to turn your quilt top into an official quilt. In this video, we'll cover the first half on how to finish a quilt, which will include making the binding and then attaching that binding to the front of the quilt. The only tools that haven't appeared in this series which I'll be using today are a disappearing ink marker and quilt clips. These are also called binding clips because they're made to hold thick layers nicely. Making the binding. The standard binding width is 2 1/4 or 2 1/2 inches. 2 1/2 is a great start for beginners, and it's what I'm cutting mine to. If you're working on a quilt pattern, it typically tells you how many strips to cut. Otherwise, you'll need to join enough strips to go around the perimeter of the quilt, plus about 20 inches extra. Once all your strips are cut, trim the selvage ends. Now place 2 strips perpendicularly at the ends, with right sides together. Offset them just a bit, like this, which will help you see where your stitches begin and end. Then, mark a diagonal line from the 2 outer corners, and then sew along that line. Repeat this with the remaining strips until you create one long binding strip. Next, trim the excess fabric a 1/4 inch away from each seam that you made, and discard these triangle bits. Also, trim the dog ears, those pointy things that are sticking out. Press all the seams open, and with the wrong sides together, fold and press the strip in half along its entire length. Okay, we've made the binding. Binding prep. Making sure not to start near a corner, we'll need a nice open space for when we join the binding ends together. Use the clips to align the raw edges of your quilt and the raw edges of your binding, leaving about the first 6 inches wild and free. Continue doing this, spacing them a few inches apart. On a side note, temporarily attaching the binding to the quilt with clips is optional. Though they add undesirable weight to your quilt, I find them helpful for feeding the binding in the quilt evenly through the machine. Otherwise, aligning the binding to the quilt as you sew can create a finished quilt with wavy edges, like this example here. Okay, when you get to a corner, flip the binding away from the quilt to create a 45-degree diagonal fold that hits the very corner of your quilt. Finger press to create a nice crease mark. You'll know you're getting the proper angle when the raw edges of the binding line up with the edge of your quilt here. Then, flip the binding back towards the quilt to create a second fold that should align along this edge of the quilt. Continue clipping and stop when you're about 10 to 12 inches away from your first clip. You'll have loose ends on both sides, which is exactly what we want. Attaching the binding. Okay, it's time to sew the binding to the quilt. Start sewing where you made that first clip using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Remove the clips as you go. Thanks to the clips, I'm not subconsciously tugging or wrestling with my binding as I sew. When you get near the corner, move aside the flappy fold. Stop a 1/4 inch away from the end and backstitch. You don't need a ruler because that 1/4 inch is where your diagonal crease mark is. Then you'll rotate the quilt, folding that flap back down, and resume sewing. Stop when you're 10 to 12 inches away from the very first stitch. It should be where your last clip is. Joining the binding ends. Making sure this side of the quilt is resting nice and flat on a surface, align the bottom tail straight, and then place the top tail over it, keeping all of the raw edges aligned. Trim the top tail so the ends overlap by the starting width of your binding strip. In other words, I started with 2 1/2 inch strips, so the overlap will also be 2 1/2 inches. If you started with 2 1/4 inch strips, then the overlap is 2 1/4. I'm just going to mark where I need to cut the top tail, and then I'll trim right here. Okay, so now my binding has a 2 1/2 inch overlap. Unfold and place the ends perpendicularly, right sides together. So the top tail is right side facing up, and then you'll place the bottom tail with its right side facing down on top of it. At this point, you can fold the quilt up like what I'm doing here to give you some slack. Do not offset them like we did when we made the binding. Just keep their edges aligned like what I'm doing here. Then you'll secure the end with pins and mark a diagonal line from the 2 outer corners. Sew along that line and trim the excess fabric a 1/4 inch away from the seam, and press or just finger press the seam open. Fold the newly joined strip in half with wrong sides together, and complete sewing the binding to the quilt, backstitching at the beginning and end to secure the seam. Okay, we're almost done. The last part of the series is next up, where we'll attach the binding to the back of the quilt, either by machine or by hand. I'll show you both, so I hope to see you there. Thanks for watching.